And good evening and welcome. I'm Mark Pinto here with you from Phoenixville Public Library. And I'm pleased to welcome you after a month's hiatus to the latest program in the Community Gardening Around the Village series. Program tonight, perfect for fall and we prepare for colder weather. The Abundant Harvest, how to preserve and process your fruits and vegetables. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to give a shout out to all the partners that we have for this series that we've been doing for nearly a year now. Phoenixville Communities That Care, Phoenixville Recreation Department, Phoenixville Area Transition Living Landscape, Penn State Extension, Camp Hill, Kimberton Hills, Phoenixville Hospital, Trellis for Tomorrow, and the Chester County Food Bank. Thanks so much, guys. Tonight's speaker is well known to Phoenixville Public Library patrons, although this is her first presentation in the Community Gardening series. Liz Alakszay is an avid organic gardener, naturalist, engineer, and educator who has been gardening for over 40 years. She was the Penn State Extension Chester County Master Gardener Coordinator for over 6 years before retiring in 2017. In addition to teaching numerous gardening classes for the Chester County Night School, she's worked at Longwood Gardens as a continuing education instructor and course designer on vegetable gardening. Currently, she works for PharmaLex Corporation, overseeing and ensuring quality process operations internationally in the pharmaceutical industry. A reminder that you can type questions into the chat during the presentation and Liz will address them at the very end. So with that, we welcome Liz. Liz, take it away.
Thanks, Mark. It's really my pleasure to join in this series again and do another gardening program for everybody. And I'd like to welcome everyone to a discussion this evening on how to preserve the abundant harvest. And I don't know if you've noticed, but this year seems to be a very abundant. The garden has been very abundant. I don't know how any way else to phrase it. I talked to a lot of people that are drowning in tomatoes and peppers and everything else. I had a tremendous peach crop, so hopefully you have too. And tonight, let's talk about how to save that and preserve those wonderful fruits and vegetables from your garden. So I want to talk about really techniques and timing for harvesting. I know we're at the end of the season, but you know, the garden is still going fairly strong. And then I want to talk about the methods for the short-term and long-term saving of your produce. I do want to mention a few important facts about food safety and processing. And I'll talk a little bit about seed saving. And then I'm going to switch over to do some live hands-on, just showing you some of the equipment and things to remember and do, you know, kind of in a more hands-on session after we finish the PowerPoint part. So let's get started about harvesting. If you want to keep your garden going, one of the major things that you want to do is you want to keep picking those vegetables, because the more you pick, the more the plant says to itself, kind of figuratively. It's like, oh darn, I really need to make fruits or vegetables or some sort of a mechanism. I need to do this because I need to make seeds so I can have another generation of either tomatoes, peppers, squash, whatever. So if you pick a tomato or you pick a squash, the plant is going to very happily start generating another one. If you have had your fill of the vegetable, stop picking, and the vegetable says, oh, I'm done, you know, I've got plenty of seeds made, I don't need to worry about that. So if you are at the end of your rope with what to do with zucchini, that's a really good technique. Please stop picking. Yes, you will get some giant ones, but the plant will slow down. Watering regularly is really important to keep the harvest going. It hasn't been too much of an issue this season. We've had a fairly decent amount of rain and fairly regularly. Always make sure that you're controlling any insects and diseases, that they're under control to keep your plants healthy and producing. Weeding, that's that chore never ends. And you don't want the weeds to compete with your vegetables and fruit. And by this time, you had initially added amendments in the spring, and then hopefully another little dose by midsummer. But here in the fall, you really want the plants to finish up and finish producing, so you really don't need a lot more fertilizer. In fact, probably nothing at this point, unless you want to squeeze in some lettuce before the end of the season. If you want to overwinter, that's a different presentation. But if for things that you want to plants to finish up in this season, you really want to go very, very light on any additional amendments, and especially nitrogen. Nitrogen encourages rapid growth, and that's not where you are at this point in the gardening season. So, so you're keeping your plants going, but what about this harvesting part? Harvesting ideally is done early in the morning, when things are the coolest and the plant actually has the highest moisture content. I know there's been a lot of, we call like tales of, picking with the first dew, but science has really proven that you want to pick the plant when temperatures are cool, the plant hasn't started photosynthesizing and using up the vitamins and minerals and all the content that's in the plant itself, because during the day when it's photosynthesizing, it's using all those ingredients to foster growth. And also in the morning, that's where the moisture content is the highest. And so by picking the plant early, before it essentially what I call has waken up and started to get its gears going, you've got the highest nutrient content and the highest water content. So the plant what you've picked will stay fresh longer and have the best value for food. Now, when is a crop ready? It kind of depends on the plant itself. I've got a picture of green tomatoes. We know that is, for most tomatoes, green is not the ripe stage. And when that tomato turns red is somewhat dependent on the variety, but it also depends on the growing conditions and where you are. You might have, your tomatoes might ripen before your neighbor's tomatoes ripen, etc. So it's, dependent on where you're located, plus the variety that you've grown. And then once you pick that fruit, it's done. I mean, it's not going to pick up any more moisture. It's not going to add any more nutrients because you've cut it off from the supply on that. So let's talk a little bit more about specific techniques when you're harvesting. First of all, as tempting as it is, and a lot of pictures show people just grabbing and pulling fruits or vegetables, you really want to use a cutting tool. You don't want to damage the host plant. Since it's still producing. I mean, when you're actually getting rid of the plant, it's the end of the season. Okay, I'll forgive you. You can yank the plant, the fruit off. But while it still has, more to go, it's, cut the peppers, cut the eggplants, cut your melons, cabbage, and head crops like lettuce and cabbage and kale. If you want to cut the whole thing, pulling that out of the ground is a little messy. So it's just, just cut it off at the soil line and bring it in. And if you are, cutting a whole head of lettuce or any of those leafy crops, you want to cut as close to the soil line as possible. Now, if you're harvesting lettuce and greens as a, like a spring mix, then you really want it to continue growing for several cycles. So you'd be really cutting it with scissors or shears and leaving 1 inch above the soil line, so the plant will regenerate and grow some more. So you can harvest at least 3 or 4 times if you use it as a cut and come again kind of crop. And so when you're cutting this plant or cutting the fruit off, you really want to rest it in your hand. Again, you don't really want to yank it. You want to rest it because it's chances are if you cut it and you're not holding on to it, it's going to fall on the ground. And us, especially tomatoes, the homegrown variety are wonderful and delicious, but they're soft. So if you drop it on the ground, chances are it's going to be kind of mushy. Now, bulb crops like garlic, onions, carrots, you can pull at the leaves, but it's also easier sometimes to have a little spade or a little fork and just loosen it, because sometimes if it's really tight in there, you're going to end up pulling the top and the rest of it is stuck in the ground. Unless you have really, really soft ground, not going to work that way. So again, have a tool with you and pull that up to get that out of the ground. Now, things that are really much deeper in the soil, like potatoes, your longer carrots, you're going to have to dig for that. And you want to start digging further away from where that you think the plants are, because you might end up spearing it. Even if you are really careful, you're probably going to end up spearing a few of your potatoes. Not so much with your carrots. They tend to be going straight down. So you'll probably, if you're digging down, you'll probably get those. But potatoes, they're spread, the tubers are spread out. And even if you're starting far away from them, chances are you might cut into one or two of those guys. And so it's, but it's a lot of fun. So you kind of pry around with a fork and then you gently lift up your root crops out of the ground. And it's easiest to do these before it rains. You don't want to really dig around in wet soil. So you really want to time that so you have a nice, fairly dry soil to get these guys out of the ground. So you've harvested, so you've picked, cut, dug up your vegetables and fruits. And then it's like, well, what do we do with this? How do we preserve these? What about the storage? But let's start with the easy one. Let's talk about root crops. And these are things like sweet potatoes, your carrots, your onions, your garlic, your potatoes. You want to do something which is called curing and drying. So after you've dug these up, you don't really clean them up too much. You shake some of the dirt off. Again, remember you were doing this while it was dry. So it's not going to be muddy. And you put them on shallow trays, those trays that if you buy plants, and they have the mesh on the bottom, they make really good drying trays. And you put them in a shady spot. If you've got a garden shed that's has some shelves in there, you can put them in there. Anywhere you've got decent air circulation, and you let them dry for about 6 days, a week. If you forget about them after a week, 2 weeks isn't going to hurt you on that. But you really want those to dry a little bit and cure. Because what that does, it hardens the outer skin, keeps the vitamins and minerals and the moisture content, in that vegetable after that skin cures and dries. And then these things will last for quite a while, several months, especially potatoes. And, garlic can last until next spring. Onions can last till next spring once it's cured on that. Now, carrots, not particularly. They'll need to go into a moist, cool spot. But your tubers, potatoes, onions, garlics, they need the dry storage conditions. So for this long-term storage, what I'm alluding to these, you've got the cool and dry, you've got the cold and dry, and the cold and moist. And so, where I was saying that your tubers that you've dried out, that you've let cure, they can go into the cool and dry spot. Most of our basements are probably fine for that, between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 60% relative humidity. And really, they will stay till next spring. You have to check if you're doing potatoes. check the variety, the ones that say good for long-term storage. Those are the ones that will keep longer. There's ones that are medium storage varieties that won't keep that long. And then the very short-term varieties keep about a month and then they start sprouting on you. So you want to use those guys up fast. Then there's the cold and dry. And I'm going to skip that for a second. And then cold and moist. I had mentioned, your carrots, once you pull those, I don't really cure the carrots because I end up eating them. But if I need to store them, I actually just leave them in the soil in the garden because the soil will stay cold and moist all winter. Yes, it will freeze, but the carrots will be fine and they're good. The roots they're good down to 32 and the soil is a nice insulator. So when the soil thaws a little bit and they need a carrot, I can pull it out. It's better than, because my other choice is putting it in the refrigerator, and that, space there is at a premium. So I tend to leave my carrots and parsnips in the soil in the garden because that has that 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's fairly moist on that. But if you do pull them, they will put them in, your vegetable section of your refrigerator, and they'll keep fine. So it's cold and dry. What is cold and dry? Like I said, we'll get back to the cold and dry in a sec. This home refrigerator, that's the cold and that is your cold and dry, 50% relative humidity. So things like your peppers, melons, fruits, they don't have a large, once you've picked them, unless you're going to do some preserving on that and some processing, they don't keep very long, a week at most. So they're the things that go into the cold and dry, relatively dry. The non-crisper part of your refrigerator, your vegetable storage part of your refrigerator. On that, if you have an old farmhouse type setting and you do have a root cellar, that's a cold and moist. That would be, if you like the carrot storage situation that I had mentioned on that you're looking for a longer term solution to keep your harvest. So the refrigerator is for those really perishable short term vegetables. Like, if you pick a whole bunch of lettuce, that's not going to keep very long. You want to keep that cold, and it's cold and dryish, but so again, it's 5 days max you're going to get out of fresh lettuce. Even if you put it into a plastic bag, it's going to get pretty icky in there after that. So what happens if you have a very abundant harvest? And so you have a handful of potatoes, some carrot, or some onions, some garlic. So that's good. And you're like, okay, we can take care of that. But if you have an overabundance of tomatoes, zucchini, cantaloupes, peppers, and all those things that if you put them in the cold and moist condition of your refrigerator, you've got to eat them within a week. You're like, there's no way I can do this with all those tomatoes. What are your options in there? Well, that's where the fun comes in. And that's where, my summer is extremely busy between everything and then trying to keep up with all the vegetables and fruits. Here's your 4 options that you have. You can freeze, dry, can, or pickle. And I didn't put on here dehydrate. I really ought to update this. You can also dehydrate things. But if you're pressed for time, really the easiest and the fastest, provided you've got freezer space or you have an extra freezer, is freezing. You pick the vegetable or the fruit. And for many vegetables, you blanch it, which means you put it in boiling water for 3 minutes. You remove it from boiling water. You let it dry a little bit, you stuff it into freezer bags, and then you stuff the freezer bag, label the freezer bag with the content and the date, and you stuff it into your freezer and you're done. That's the fastest way to preserve your harvest. It's also the one that preserves most of the vitamins and minerals because you're doing very minimal heating to that that vegetable and fruit. Now with fruit, you don't need to blanch. So if you have an abundance of, say, cantaloupe, you peel your cantaloupe, you cube it or make little cantaloupe balls, and you can just freeze that. You can use that in desserts. You know, it's, if you thought it's going to be mushy, so, but you can use it as a frozen dessert. If you have strawberries or blueberries, you can do, you know, there's, you just freeze them as a berry, strawberry as a berry. You can put that onto into baked goods, on cereals, and you can also make jam with that. Anything that you freeze. I had a really overabundance of peaches, so I froze a bunch of peaches. With peaches and fruit that has like a skin like that, you want to peel the skin off. So you're doing a little bit of blanching to heat it so you can pull the skin off of that, but very minimal. And then you just freeze it. So that's really the fastest and easiest preservation method. But like I said, you do have to have freezer space. So, you know, if you have an extra chest freezer, that's really handy, or two, or if you have, you know, a big refrigerator with freezer space, that's really your limiting factor in that. The next easiest is really drying, but drying does change flavor and texture of what you're preserving. But it will, and dehydrating sort of falls under that because that's mechanical drying under heat. It's, you know, if we lived in the Southwest, you could do it. You could dehydrate a lot of things just by leaving them in the sun. Here in humid Pennsylvania, you really need to buy a dehydrator and run that. Yeah, you know, it can run several days to really say if you want to dehydrate a tomato or something that's really wet, just because it's pulling the moisture out and it's hard in a humid climate. It's a very great way. It's a really good way of preserving things because it, you know, that shrinks the space that it takes up because you're pulling all the moisture out. Just with the humidity in here, there's that factor that we're fighting our humid climate. But with herbs, this is a real popular technique. For them, you cut them and you hang them in an area where there's no sunlight, but there's great airflow. And in a few weeks, they will become crispy. And then you can just powder them up and have, you know, your, you know, I'm trying to think of parsley flakes, basil flakes, sage flakes, whatever. I do a lot of mint. I have a kitty, so I do catnip that I dry that way. That's, again, fairly easy. You just need the space to hang the plant up and dry it. You know, I could put it in a dehydrator, but it's less energy intensive just to air dry the herbs on that. But it does change. The flavor becomes more intense, and of course, the things become crispy on that. Because if it dries out, you know, all the moisture is out of there, and so the flavor really concentrates. And maybe that's why the cat goes so crazy over the catnip, but that's a whole different story. I'm going to jump over to pickling because I'm going in the order of easiest after freezing and drying. The next easiest is pickling. You can do what I call quick pickling with vinegar, which is pretty simple. It's heating vinegar and adding some flavorings and herbs to that and pouring that over your whatever vegetable it is that you want to pickle. And then there's the fermentation route, which takes a while, depending on what kind of fermentation you're doing on that. That could take a few weeks to get that done. Again, these are very easy to do in order of ease and time. And then I'm going to jump over to the canning. That's the most complicated. Not, you know, that shouldn't scare you off, but it's the one that's most labor intensive. You harvest things at their peak flavor, and you process it, you know, either by cooking or adding other ingredients to it, chopping it up. And then you can it, put it into a jar, and you either pressure can it, and I'll show you what that looks like, or hot water bath canning it. The idea there is to create a bacteria-free environment, so the thing that's in the can will last about a year. On that, you're mimicking, if you went to the grocery store and you see everything in a can, you're doing that process at home. Not really difficult at all. It's just labor intensive. My tomato sauce processing takes about 3-4 days to get it to the consistency and the thickness of the sauce that I want. But it's a lot of fun to do. But if I'm in a real hurry, I will freeze instead. So there's I do have this website here that it's a part of the USDA and Department of Agriculture that has a really good information on food preservation on that. And I will we'll get you that URL after the presentation on that. But it really does go through all the finer points of the canning part of food preservation. And I'm sure the library has references and resources about canning and food safety. And the one great resource is the Ball Corporation, who does the jars, makes many of the jars that we use for canning. They have what's called the Ball Blue Book. They have a new edition of that also goes through talking about the proper methods and the safety concerns that you want to make sure that you do when you're preserving on that. And there's, if you really want to get into the science and details of food preservation, good resources on that. Seed saving is a form of preserving your harvest, because beans, dried beans, if you grow those, that's seed saving, and that's a form of preserving. Really, probably even easier than freezing if you grow those kind of crops. But if you're saving seeds to grow plants next year, that's also part of what we're talking about here. You really want to save seeds that are, I call annuals. Basically, I hesitate to say that in a way because tomatoes are perennial, but in our climate, where we live, they're annuals. They just can't stand the really, really cold. But you want the self-pollinating ones, basically your heirlooms, not your hybrids. So the kind of plant that you're going to get is going to be the same thing that you had this year. The hybrids will produce viable seed. It's just you don't know if the plant is going to be what you grew this year, or is it going to be something else because it's a hybrid. It could be fun, or it could turn out to be whatever your plant that you grow from that hybrid seed is totally inedible, but it's always a fun experiment to try. And here's the hard part when you're saving seeds to grow plants for the following year. You want to save the fruit and vegetable that is the best, the biggest, and the most wonderful plant on the plant itself. That's the one that you really want to eat is the one that you want to save the seeds to grow plants next year. So, that biggest tomato, the juiciest big tomato. Now with tomatoes, you can scoop the seed out and you can still eat like parts of it, but not the whole thing. On that, so that's always a test of your willpower. It's like, never mind, I'll just buy seeds next year, versus saving your own. And on that, garlic. If you grow garlic, you also can save the largest garlic cloves, the whole clove itself, to replant the following year. On that, instead of eating it, because then you replant that to get another crop of garlic the following year. And actually with garlic, you would be planting that in October. Another presentation on that. But feel free to ask questions on that. Now, on the beans, saving those, super easy. You wait until the bean is, and this is all legumes, is totally dry, and then you pluck out the seeds and you're done. The other ones are a little bit more, darn, I didn't mention that. The other ones are a little bit more tricky. I mean, I have a picture of lettuce there. You have to wait for that to flower, and it will flower if you let it go. You know, you don't pick it, you let it go. And then you get a stalk of flowers, and then the seeds show up. So you would be shaking the seeds off. Things like tomatoes and melons and squash and peppers. With tomatoes, you're going to cut that open when it's fully ripe and scoop out the seeds. Let those seeds sit for a day or two until they get moldy, and then you wash them and dry them. And then you put them in a little package of, a little paper envelope or a jar, put it in your refrigerator, and then you're good till you want to plant them next year. Peppers, you want to wait until it like overripe, totally shriveled overripe on the plant, and then scoop out the seeds. They don't need to do any fermentation. With the tomato, that mold, that you want to leave it sit and kind of get gooey and moldy, because that mold actually creates a preservative on the seed, so the seed doesn't get any disease on that. It's pretty cool. Peppers don't need that treatment. Melons are really easy. Squash is really easy. You scoop the seed out, you dry it, and you save it. Now, having said that, though, if you're growing like 5 different varieties of squash, and you save the seeds, they hybridize amongst each other. So you might not get the butternut that you think you're saving the seeds from if you also grew regular pumpkins and another, let's say some gourds, because they all interbreed, and the end result could be something really interesting next year or whatever shows up. So, but if you're only growing butternuts or you're only growing zucchinis of one variety, the seeds, they're big, they're easy. You just have to wait for it to be totally ripe to save that. What I don't have on here, but if you're growing sunflowers to eat, and you wait for the entire sunflower to finish flowering and the petals fall off, and if you can get to the middle before the squirrels get to it or the birds get to it, you just scrape that out and they're done and they're ready to eat. So the storage becomes really easy with these seeds. Once they're washed and dried, you store them in airtight containers or moisture-proof envelopes, and just make sure you put on what plant it was, when you picked it, so you know what it is. Say if you have several tomatoes, more or less self-pollinate, so you don't have to worry about cross-pollination. So you put grandmom's tomato or a brandywine tomato on there, so you don't mix it up with another variety, because it's really easy to do. Same thing with like cucumbers and melons. The seeds look very similar, so you want to make sure you label things when you're saving those seeds. Now, beans, you can usually tell, by the color that, this is a kidney bean, this is a lima bean. But it's not a bad idea to label those too. And then you store these in a cool, dry location. Your refrigerators are really good place for those. Beans you can store in like a mesh bag, and they can stay outside your refrigerator. That's fine. Your beans, the dry beans are fine, but your other seeds, refrigeration is really recommended. And don't keep opening and checking and saying, "Oh, I saved these seeds," because every time you open one of these, you allow moisture in. If you're going to actually cook your beans, that's a different story. But just checking in is not not recommended, or it's going to lose its viability, and also you're going to introduce you can introduce mold and bacteria in there. Generally, your larger seeds will stay longer, viable longer, and then the smaller seeds. But by refrigerating seeds, and even if you don't need them, or you're not going to say grow plants or eat them, you can freeze those and they will you can keep them frozen for years, literally. Seed companies don't want you to know that, but they will keep fine, and then you just de-thaw them when you need them. And in the refrigerator, they'll keep up to five, 6 or more years and still be viable. Now, they're really, really tiny seeds, especially your herbs, they don't, they'll start losing moisture much faster than your larger seeds. So their lifespan is maybe 3-4 years as opposed to 5 to 10 years in your refrigerator on that. So with that, that's our really kind of our high level. Let's run through preserving your abundant harvest. I don't know, Mark, do we have anything in the chat before I do my show and tell?
No, nothing in the chat.
Any questions from anybody before I?
Okay, well, we'll give you another opportunity, folks, to ask questions at the end. But Liz, if you want to do your show and tell, go right ahead.
I will do my show and tell. So let me do a mute here and turn video here, unless you want to watch my bookshelf while I'm not here. All right. Is everyone there? Mark, are you there?
Yep.
Okay. Because I'm kind of on the side here. So I wanted to show folks, we're talking about the canning and preserving stuff. I'm going to start real easy. Your hold that up, your freezer bags. Real easy. My favorite way, until I run out of freezer space. So I will take something like here's my wonderful squash that I just picked today. I will chop this up into little circles, put it in boiling water for 3 minutes, then pour it out of the boiling water, let it cool for a minute, stuff it into the bag, and stuff it into the freezer. My problem right now is I'm out of freezer space, so I actually have to cook this guy tonight. And I do have a big chest freezer, so we've had a really great harvest. So what I want to show here first, let me just move, before I do that, the crunchy herb, this is spearmint that was hanging up and dried out. And I just leave it on the branch. You notice there's where I cut the stalk. And when I want to make spearmint tea, I will just take out a leaf and just actually not a leaf, a branch, and take off the leaves and make tea out of it. And it smells really spearminty once I take it out of the bag. You notice these great zipper bags, the greatest invention next to the freezer bags to store these things in. So what I have here, this is a pressure canner that you're looking at sitting on my stovetop. And this is for the non-acidic foods. So your tomatoes are acidic. And I'm trying to think of your strawberries, things that you're making jam out of. You would not use this to preserve those, but things like beans, squash, the non-acidic foods, you need to use a pressure canner. And that's basically what I call a pressure bomb. You put the jars will go in here, You seal this up pretty tight, and you have to boil, basically there's boiling water in there, and you have to have it at a certain pressure to kill off the bacteria on a non-acidic food. So it's much more, you really have to read the directions on your pressure cooker, basically, or your pressure canner. Because what goes on here, and I'll show a close-up, is this weight that sits on the valve that releases the pressure. And it has different designations. Mine has a 5, 10, 15. And the recipe will tell you what you have to put that on, because this will jiggle as the pressure is maintained at either the 5 pounds per square inch, 15 or 10. And that's on that little device. It's ingrained on there, but it's really, if you have a pressure canner, read the directions, check out that USDA site. Not hard, but you have to really have to follow the directions to do the non-acidic foods, because this is under pressure, and you have to slowly release the pressure, because it'll suck the lid on, and you have to release that slowly through the valve, so you can take the lid off, because it is pretty tight on there. And then the food it'll keep, but that's the non-pressurized or non-acidic foods need to be pressure canned. And these are very heavy, good grief, super heavy, iron, nature canning stuff going on here. I tend to, beans, would be canned beans. When I have time to do something like that is what I tend to use it for. But anything that you want preserved, it's not naturally acidic, it needs to go into one of these devices. So let me move this guy aside. Oh my gosh. Don't drop it on your foot, because it's good. The walls are a good inch thick on that to hold the different pressure. This vessel here is your hot water bath. Much easier. This is meant for food that's acidic. Just a nice light aluminum vessel with a holder to put your cans on. The other one has a holder, but that's basically a base within there. And this is meant for your tomato sauce, your acidic foods, your jams, your jellies, mixed things that are still acidic would go into the hot water bath canning device here. Even having said that, though, as an insurance, even on your tomatoes, this thing called citric acid, just to make sure your pH is still acidic, because what you're trying to prevent, by the pressure canning and the hot water bath, is you want to prevent botulism, basically, that nasty bacteria that's pretty nasty. And by maintaining the pH in terms of something that's acidic, you'll prevent that. And in the other terms, the high pressure canning will create a condition that doesn't allow the spores to grow. So those are your two methods of food safety there. So you want to make sure, because a lot of our newer tomatoes that are sweet, the pH isn't quite as acidic as you'd like. So the citric acid is your extra insurance in that. And the recipe you're following will tell you if you need a half a teaspoon, a quarter teaspoon extra in there to do that. So then let's talk the jars themselves. If you're doing jams and jellies, these are the little jars, the little guys like this. Typically you work jams and jellies and butters, fruit butters in small jars and in small batches, and they will go into a smaller jar like that. Your tomato sauces, pepper rings go into larger jars, we're talking larger jars. like this, or the pint jar like that. You notice these are called regular mouth. Don't kill yourself here. And then there's also wide mouth. You notice the bigger opening versus the smaller opening. Something to consider if you're doing pickles, it's a whole heck of a lot easier to get pickles out of a wide mouth jar than a skinnier mouth jar. Something to consider. It doesn't mean that you can't can it in the other jar. It's just think of convenience of trying to get those pickle spears out of there.
Liz, the wide mouth jar is off camera. We can't really see that.
Yeah, there's your wide mouth. And there's your regular mouth. So it's just the fatter on that. And of course they take the different lids. You know, there's the lids that are big, and then there's the lids that are small. And let me just show the inside of that lid, the mystery of the inside of the lid. Oops, I lose the ring. This is the lid itself on that, and you notice there's a rubber seal around it. That's what seals when it's heated either by the pressure method or the hot water bath. That seal is the one that what I call gum loosens up and gums and actually adheres to the rim of that jar. So when you're canning, you want to make sure that rim, you want to wipe that off before putting the lid on to make sure that it's clean and there's a good seal between this orange part and the glass part, because that's your insurance that it's a good seal. Since I dropped the ring, and a lot of people don't quite kind of leave this on, but this is the ring that goes on the top of the jar or top of the lid. So the lid goes in there. And there's your lid. So you're going to screw, this gets screwed on. It's just hand tight onto that jar, not any tighter. And it will hold. And as it heats up, like I said, that inside seal will seal. And when you're done, this this comes off. A lot of people leave this on. You really don't need, that does no good once the seal, this is basically there to hold the lid in place so it seals. And once that's done, this can come off when you're done. And you know that you have a good seal because these lids, I don't know if you're going to hear that. Once it's done and you have your jars out, you take your jars out of your device, they're out of your canning thing, you'll hear this sound. And that's because a vacuum is created in the jar and that sucks this little lid in. And so you get a bunch of this popping sound in your kitchen or wherever you're canning, and you know you're good. And the way to test that is when it cools, you just press down, and if you don't hear any popping, you know it's a good seal. If it
Liz, you're off camera again.
Yeah, if this thing pops, you know you don't have a good seal. You can either reprocess or just eat it within a week on that. That's your safety on that. So I get a bunch of popping going on in the kitchen when I'm showing up, and I've got a dog showing up in the kitchen who knows that popping sounds mean food. Hi, you don't need to be on camera. Please don't knock my camera. You can't see her nose, but she's like, oh, it means food is here. So that's something that to be aware of on that. And then the lids are nice because they can write what's in your jar right on the lid with like a Sharpie, one of those permanent markers on that. Another technique here on this jar. Now I just want to, I'm going to do this from the outside. So you've got your jar that's in, pretend this is on the inside. When you're filling this with water, you want to make sure there's 1 inch of water above the top of that jar. So the whole thing is submerged and gets the boiling treatment. And 1 inch is the recommended, at least 1 inch above that top of that jar. So this is resting in there, and you've got to have enough water. So this vessel is almost filled to the rim with water when you're working. Yes, and it will bubble and it will spit on your stove if you're using these large jars. That's perfectly okay. You're not doing anything wrong. It's just the nature of bubbling. Just don't stand there because it's hot. On that. And speaking of hot, so hopefully I'm on camera for that. Because you're working with hot things, you need to invest in some equipment. This is a jar lifter. I'm going to use a little jar, but it means that you don't touch your jar. It grabs your jar and you can lift it out of your hot vessel without burning yourself. And please wear mitts when you're doing this. On that, again, hot. And as you're processing things, your lids have to be hot. So they're in another little vessel that you're keeping them hot, not boiling, but hot. So they're sterilized. What I have here is a jar lifter, which is just a magnet at the end of a stick here. So you can reach into the hot water and grab your jar lids, your hot jar lids, to put on your jars without burning your fingertips. So these, you need to buy a few equipment like that. Again, a jar lift, lid lifter, and a jar lifter device. And to pour things, of course, some sort of funnel to pour it into the jar so you're not making a mess. I still make a mess, but that helps. So the idea is just to keep everything super clean on that. Lastly, I have brought some peppers in. Right. Since I decided I have no freezer room and I'm out of jar lids, and there seems to be a shortage of jar lids at the moment. Supply chain issues, they tell me. What I'm holding here, let's see, cherry tomatoes. Remember I said the freezing thing? You can also freeze cherry tomatoes and just then drop them into soup when you need them. I have a bunch of these, but I'll probably end up cooking these. But I could just wash these and just freeze them as is once I take these little green stems off. And show you how easy it is. These are heirloom Christmas lima beans. This is my favorite thing. I could probably even finish this tonight. And so they're crispy dry. I picked them off the plant, and there's the seeds.
Yeah, Liz, you're off camera again.
Yeah, I'm looking at the camera, and I love this iPad. There we go. There it is. So that's your Christmas limas. So they're finished. If everybody, and that's an heirloom bean, but it's, like I said, it's really easy, just picking it off the picking the pod and just crunching the pod, and it's no processing required other than peeling it out. So nothing better to do, just peel your dried beans and they're done. If you hear the crunch, and there they are. Just need to pull them out of there. Very easy. Either put them in the jar or put them in a baggie. The beans are super easy to do. Now that's what I have for a demo. I was thinking of pepper rings. Hot peppers. These are the right ripeness to chop them up as pepper rings. And that would be chopping them into circles, boiling some vinegar, stuffing these into a jar, and then boiling them for like 10 minutes or so on that. And Mark, I don't know, if the library has the newer copy, but this is like what I call the Bible of canning via the hot water bath and the pressure canner to follow the directions in there. So I'm going to head back to my other computer. On that, and I'll see you guys in a minute.
And meantime, if anybody has any questions for Liz, you can type them now into the chat. There was one question that I did see that we'll have her answer. Okay, Liz, there is one question that came up earlier in the chat.
Yes, I'm back.
About what vegetables would you not blanch?
I would not blanch tomato. If I was freezing tomatoes, I would not blanch tomatoes and peppers. But I would certainly blanch beans, zucchini and squash. Here's the thing. If I'm cutting them in circles and chunks, I will blanch them. But if I shred them as if, as an ingredient for, baked goods, I won't blanch. Does that answer the person's question?
I hope so. Anyone else? Yes, she says yes. Okay.
Okay, good.
Anyone else? You can feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to, if you don't need to type in the chat. Okay, well. Don't see anything else.
I hope everybody found that informative. And if you have questions, I think you can always email the library and you can email me, or, I think I have my contact information at the end of that slide.
Which will be posting the video to our YouTube channel, so people will be able to see it again there.
And, feel free to contact me anytime. If you think of a question on that.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Liz. Appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome anytime, Mark. And
thank you so much. That was wonderful.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight. Take care. Have a good night now.
Yep.